Hello and welcome,
hello everyone, and welcome to continuing coverage of the World Series of Poker here at Bally's Las Vegas, where it's time for the 2024 55th iteration No Limit Hold'em Deuce to 7 single draw 10K championship.
Let's go inside right now to have a look at this
alongside
final table
Chris
and see who made it all the way here to battle for the top prizes. By the way, if you're with us in the chat, please let us know where you're watching from. Please smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. It is very much appreciated. Waiting to see a picture here.
Looks like we're here, Ollie. Come on.
Action underway here at the featured table. 6 players strong, blinds of 25 and 50,000 with a 75K big blind ante, and there's a very familiar looking face. One Jeremy Ausmus, who has punched his way into multiple final tables already here this summer. Chris Vitch, Jesse Sylvia alongside yours truly, Ali Najad with the call. We see Mr. Lin, that's David Lin, to be exact, opening this pot with a convertible jack. Ausmus taking things under consideration from the small blind.
Yeah, David's got a super solid opening hand here. But it looks like Jeremy has found something too in the small blind. Just a call though.
This may be the most fun game to guess somebody's cards, I think, of any format of poker.
For sure. Well, he's drawing 1, so we can probably narrow it down to some sort of 4-card 9 or better in this situation. And David Lin goes ahead and breaks the jack to draw to 9-7-5-2, which is a close decision. Certainly reasonable. He's going to be a little disappointed to find this pair of 5s, though. And if Jeremy checks, we'll learn right away what sort of a player David Lin is, whether he decides to try to bluff with this pair of 5s or just check down.
Now we know, of course, that in No Limit Deuce to 7, bluffing is very part and parcel to anyone's success. And in particular, when we pair cards, we are compelled with the sense that we have no showdown value to barrel. Ausmus checks the Jack-10. And we're going to learn a little something about David Lin here. I assume, Mr. Vitch, as do you, that he didn't make it this far checking back pairs. But that's exactly what he does.
I think this is a pretty reasonable hand to check with. I mean, you want to bluff a lot of pairs, but usually from your higher pairs.
They just
you definitely have a tiny bit of showdown value with 5s.
Even if it's for like 1 second, just like that, and then you're done.
Yeah, I thought I was doing that. Maybe the last one I did.
Yeah,
when I
just
drew
gotta,
it,
like,
I didn't do it.
just do a quick, like, yeah.
As we take a look at the chip stacks here, Jesse, it kind of looks like we have a big cluster at the top and then 1 clear short stack in Jen Harman. So kind of not any sort of insane ICM situations going on at this point. Everyone has some incentives to play reasonably cautiously, but no clear runaway chip leader or anything like that. Really, anybody can kind of still establish the lead here.
Jeremy raising.
Yeah, it's certainly a fine balance between trying to break away from the pack and establish yourself as a chip lead so you can abuse the medium stacks, and not trying to put yourself at any sort of risk as well.
Now, for those who are less familiar with No Limit Deuce to 7 single draw, there are only 2 betting rounds, but given that it's no limit, it can all get in a hurry.
I assumed his queen was wrong too, but it wasn't.
Oh, it wasn't? No, oh, that's why he did have queen 6 or queen 7.
Storylines here, Vitch, not to interrupt, but obviously, as we touched on privately prior to the onset of the broadcast, World Series of Poker Player of the Year implications abound between Scott Seiver and Jeremy Ausmus, who are jockeying for points and supremacy.
They both seem to find themselves at pretty much every final table recently.
Thanks for coming out. I appreciate it.
As we see Seiver open up a fairly difficult combo to play, depending on what the action is behind him. But when you have these kind of open-ended straight draws like 8-7-6-5, you're often looking to actually pat with this queen if there's not a multi-way pot developing behind you.
Which is a bit of a dangerous game to play, right? Because the queen is never too far ahead, if ahead at all, against almost every one-card draw.
Correct. It's more or less like a really loose stealing hand that's just hoping to take down the blinds. Unfortunately, Jen wakes up, well, unfortunately for Seiver, Jen wakes up with a Jack-10 and gets to shove her relatively short stack in and take this pot down uncontested, which is an excellent result for her.
Very much so. The open-ender, one of the undesirable sorts of hands to draw to in this game. We do accept from time to time, situationally speaking, the need to get involved, but not on that occasion, Deem Seiver.
And Jen must be thrilled about that result. When you shove with the Jack-10 for only about 11 or 12 big blinds, you're sort of preparing yourself to get called and hopefully even be in a flipping situation against a draw 1. Sometimes you're even drawing dead when they pat behind you. So to just take it down there was an awesome result for her.
Jen just picked up 50% of her stack without any sort of showdown. That's really impressive in any game.
Ideally,
I was going to say there are a few worse feelings than that pat back behind you.
Exactly.
You do get called with a jack. You know you're dead.
You know you're dead, exactly. But now I was going to say that if Jen can just get herself up a little bit further, she can actually have like a reshoving stack that can really put pressure on some of those draw 1s and won't necessarily feel like she has no fold equity when she sticks it in.
Yeah, and going back to your original ICM question, if she can pick up a stack that's, would take a healthy chunk out of her opponent's stacks if she doubled through them, then they have to be very careful.
That makes sense, yeah. You can't open too many stealing hands when you have a medium short stack behind you who can make your life difficult, and like you said, put a big dent in you.
We have a lot of fun stuff going on because Jeremy and Scott Seiver have a very close race for Player of the Year. And for either of those players, throwing ICM out the window and playing for the win when they know that could push them pretty far ahead in that race might be something that they're considering.
I could definitely see that. Both of those guys, well-established, long-time high-stakes players, probably not sweating the pay jumps quite as hard as some people, strongly thinking about Player of the Year and winning a bracelet.
Now, strongly thinking about this deuce 4-4-5 jack is one Jonathan Handsome John Krella, 93,000 plus in career tournament earnings for the 41-year-old from Thunder Bay, Canada. Plenty of talent comes from north of the border. University of Waterloo economics and engineering degree holder, attacking here on the strength of the 4s and some position. Of course, Watson is going to strap in the face of the raise. He'll draw 1 to the 10-8, and Krella also going to draw 1 to a smooth jack. Disaster for Watson as he pairs the 10 and Krella pairs the 5s.
I think we should see Watson take a stab at this pot here. When you pair 10s, you really need to bluff. There's definitely a chance that your opponent could make a smaller pair, as we see Krella making, and fold. You're not really trying to get folds from medium strength hands, but you're just targeting hands like this. As we see Watson make a very small bet of 125. And there's a decent chance that this gets through. Krella made a very nice play, I think, with the raise pre-flop. You definitely want to punish the small blind limps with a fairly wide range. But I think he made a small error by deciding to keep this jack. When you have a hand as strong as 2-4-5, it's not such a bad thing to draw 2 and just try to make a strong hand. He does have the value of position. Actually, Krella turns his hand into a bluff raise here, which is quite nice. Sometimes when you're bluff raising, you are just hoping that your opponent's also bluffing, as is the case here, but you save yourself from folding the best hand. And we see Krella kind of take advantage of that range advantage that he established pre-flop with his raise to turn his hand into a bluff raise post-flop.
And I feel like for those viewing this stream who might not be as familiar with deuce to 7 no limit single draw, that was a really educational sort of hand to witness immediately.
There was a lot going on in that hand. Between the pre-flop action, the drawing decision from Krella, and the betting decisions from both players post-draw, a lot of choices and a lot of options. This definitely tells me that Krella is here to play and not necessarily going to be waiting for premium hands to put money in with, which is, in general, the right strategy in poker tournaments. So I like to see that aggression from him there. As I said, I think the only error he made was that he wanted to keep that jack because he didn't want to look weak and draw 2 after raising pre. But 2-4-5 is such a strong draw that I think he should have gone ahead and done that. But as played, I love the bluff raise post-flop, knowing that he already had a pair of 4s, making a pair of 5s, unblocking all the high pair bluffs from Watson, and getting it through for not even really that big of a raise size. He only raised about half pot.
Yeah, you might argue that pitching 2 cards there is a little more advantageous when the players are as deep as they are, since making a nutted hand has a lot more value when you have so many blinds you could potentially put in.
Absolutely. So Jen Harman opens here in the cutoff with 4, 5, 6, 10 queen, a hand that has a decent number of options to it. She only started the hand with about 14 blinds, so she had an immediate decision pre whether to open jam or go with the small raise. This small raise size is going to let David Lin continue in the big blind where she would have just got this through for a shove. Doesn't necessarily make it a bad play. Now, when David Lin draws 2, Jen has a bit of a decision as well, as a queen is a small favorite against a draw 2, but the 4, 5, 6, 10 draw has a little bit of positive implied odds where she can make a hand that could maybe consider a value bet on the river. However, with her short stack, money in the middle, I would expect her to probably stand pat here. As I am immediately incorrect.
In to the recycle bin goes the queen.
It looks like we have an exposed card here.
Seiver's on it.
Well, I wonder what card got exposed. Was it the queen?
It looks like you see that I see a 2 of spades.
Oh,
I think Jen would have received a deuce here, but it got exposed.
We need a ruling.
I know the rule. She's going to have to get the card's going to get reshuffled in, and she's going to get a new card with the opportunity to maybe still get that same card.
I'll tell you what, that could prove very impactful for the short-stacked Harman, as she would have had this pot locked up at showdown. Not a given that she gets there necessarily, but I would imagine 10-6 is always a call.
So we see Lin's hand already. He has made a pair of 3s in a draw 2 versus draw 1 situation. I wouldn't necessarily expect him to bluff here, but if Jen were to make a pair of 4s or pair of 5s, she may check back and lose this hand. So it looks like it's probably just going to go check-check as her new card is a king.
Can you just switch this down to 6, because we're 6-handed. I'm just trying to see what the payouts are. I appreciate that, thanks.
3.
So in this case, somewhat no harm, no foul, although if Jen had made a 10-6-5-4-2, she probably could have bet the end here.
Yeah, no question. And interestingly enough, Lin might be thinking to himself, I would have rather her receive a deuce, and that might have left me thinking she's paired the deuce, and maybe I can bluff at this. Not that he would have known.
Yeah. I don't think with a pair of 3s in his hand, he was very happy about it. He probably was pretty happy to let her replace it and potentially get a higher pair.
Sorry, my language. We're on the stream.
But Jesse, Jennifer Harman has now accomplished exactly what you were saying. She's now got her stack up to about 18 big blinds, which is certainly a much more threatening reshove stack. Can do some damage to any of the players at the table here.
Yeah, it almost puts her in a more difficult situation, however, because she's tied with Lin now, so she has to deal with some ICM concerns, whereas before, being far and away the shortest stack, she was relatively unhandcuffed from that issue.
The
Absolutely.
is the rhyming.
No limit single draw definitely mimics no limit hold'em in that way, where
Other than that,
the stack that you're playing relative to the other players at the table massively influences the thought process you're going to go through in hands. Jeremy has no such considerations, however, here with a premium 4-card 8 draw.
Raise 110.
It's also interesting because for a lot of the players at the table, this is a game that they play, I would imagine, a bit less than their other games. I know, you know, for a guy like Jeremy, certainly it's one of his least played games. He plays a lot of no limit. So trying to apply the effects of ICM while also trying to navigate a game that they're less familiar with is quite the task.
You don't have to be all too familiar to know that 9 perfect is a whole lot of hand in this game. Sir Watts looking down at exactly that here in the face of this Ausmus raise, which is drawing live.
We could see a big pot here, as Sir Watts certainly will be 3-betting this hand, and I can't imagine Ausmus folding an 8-6-4 3-draw in the face of this 3-bet.
Position, Chris, not unlike in any other variant of poker. Oh, so important, but tremendously slow in no limit deuce. And Ausmus will lack it if he makes the extra 220K investment, which we all anticipate he will.
Yeah, so it is unfortunate for Ausmus to be out of position. However, this is actually the sort of hand you don't mind having in a 3-bet pot, because you feel that if your opponent stands pat, you're drawing very live to beat him, and he's going to be in a defensive position after the draw, whereas you can set the price when you make your hand. You could put a lot of pressure on him even with some bluffs, as most pat hands are not really happy to see a large bet on the river. We see that Sir Watts has a very strong pat hand here, but most pats would be much more of the rough 9, rough 10, even some jack variety here.
So it will go one pat here, pot up to 810,000. Watts going to just double check and verify. There it is.
Now, if Jeremy catches a 10 or a face card, this hand's not particularly interesting. Okay, so it kind of eliminates any suspense. I was going to say it would be most interesting if he catches either makes his 8 or makes a small pair. Those would be the hands that he would have some decisions to make. He will still have one more decision to make here, as Sir Watts can certainly value bet his hand after Jeremy checks this jack 8.
Yeah, and you can't put it past Watts. He could certainly have some snows here, right? So this is a situation where Jeremy will have a real decision.
For sure. He will be able to beat all bluffs. He didn't have a relevant blocker pre, starting with an ace. So that isn't really helping him too much. But I guess we'll see what size Sir Watts comes with here. I could see everything from a tame half-pot bet up into an all-in. I highly doubt we'll see an all-in given the ICM considerations of other short stacks at the table, but it would not be unreasonable to go for a large bet with a hand this strong.
Yeah, as a general rule, you take any size you would bet normally, and then under ICM constraints, size down quite a bit in terms of percent of pot size.
And I think in some ways he has done that with this half-pot bet size, as this is a very strong holding.
Mm-hmm. And this is going to make life much more difficult for Jeremy, by the way, because he's getting 3-1. He only needs to win about a quarter of the time to flick the chips in chip EV terms, at least.
He beats zero value hands. He is getting a good price to try to catch a bluff. I guess the question he has to be asking himself is how often would Watts go for a snow pre with 3 players behind him and sort of a middling chip stack?
Yeah, you imagine he'd have some kind of super premium bluffing hand, like 3 threes or 2 pair, something like that, which doesn't come up that often.
Correct. And Jeremy does decide to give him credit for a legit hand. It's kind of funny how, much like in no-limit hold'em situations, in some ways Jeremy may be more suspicious of a large bet, right? Because there are very few hands that are good enough to bet for big value on the river. Like if you think about all of Sir Watts' medium strength hands like bad 9s or a good 10, they all seem like they would want to bet the small size. By betting, if he were to bet a big size there, it would certainly polarize him between premium hands, which are rare, and fun bluffing hands, which are also somewhat rare.
I think that's really well put. Back in the day, I used to have a little trick up my sleeve where I would bet quite large with a lot of my value hands, and my opponents would give me some sort of very polar range and hero off against me.
Sure, that makes sense. I mean, it kind of is human nature to be a little more suspicious of the large bet, even though from a pure pot odds perspective, we'd rather call the small bet.
Now, as we look out at these chip stack depths, Chris, you know, we're very accustomed to sensing when someone is short stacked and when someone is deep stacked in terms of big blinds in the no-limit hold'em streets. Are there different thresholds when it comes to no-limit deuce?
Yes and no. Certain hand classes benefit from, say, open jamming all in for, say, between 10 and 15 big blinds, whereas other hand classes are relatively happy to stick with a min-raise strategy. But I would say that now that Jen Harman has clawed out of the danger zone here, we're not in a situation where anyone really has an open jamming stack. Many players here, at least Lin and Harman, would have like 3-bet all-in stacks.
Now, if this were a cash game and not a final table, raise sizes, 3-bet sizes would be a bit larger than we've seen so far, correct? Because equities between a 1-card draw and a 1-card draw run fairly close. There's a big ante in there.
Correct. Typically, we see a small open size with a larger 3-bet size, because a lot of your hands that would like to 3-bet are hoping to generate fold equity, right? Like a lot of times if you have a weak pat hand, you know that all the 4-card draws are drawing very live against you. Let me interrupt here because we have a very interesting pot brewing here, as Scott Seiver has gone for an overbet after a draw 2, draw 3 situation with a pair of 6s.
Note that this was limp pre-flop blind versus blind.
And
hence
Jeremy
the
has
draw
made
2, draw 3.
Jeremy has made quite a strong hand for the situation. However, facing an overbet, your 9-7 does shrink up just a little bit in terms of whether it's an easy value raise, or maybe you would prefer to take a conservative just call. Certainly this bluff from Seiver is not going to get through.
Yeah, this seems far too far up in Jeremy's range after drawing 3 to ever consider folding.
Yeah, he's between raise and call here. In general, in a draw 2 versus draw 3 situation, value thresholds go down a little bit. We could see Seiver betting a hand as weak as a queen low for value. However, when he chooses this size, he's saying that he has a very good hand or a bluff. Don't quite remember what Jeremy started with for blockers pre. I think he had some face cards. That would incline me to raise a little bit more, as I would be thinking I can get value from worse 9s and 10s. And it does look like Jeremy has found the raise. And obviously Scott, well, this hand just has to be over, I would think. He should not really think he has any fold equity if he were to jam 3-bet as a bluff here for 600K more. But he is a very creative and fearless player, so I suppose we shouldn't count it out. I think this is mostly just posturing from Scott, though.
Yeah, sometimes you don't want your opponent to know that you had a bluff right away, so you have to pretend to give it a little contemplation before throwing the cards in. But you never know. This is Scott Seiver. He could be considering one of the more heroic bluffs I've seen him.
I mean, I guess he could also be considering a heroic call. In theory, he probably beats all bluffs with 6s here. But I just don't think so. I mean, it would just be such a loss to his chip stack when he's in a totally fine, comfortable position right now.
I also believe that Scott started the day as the short stack and has ran his chips up since then. So if that is the case, it's often a little less exciting to give them away on a massive hero call.
Yeah, I would say of most players at the table, though, I don't think that is Scott's thought process as much as it is some. If he thinks it's the right thing to do, I believe he's just going to trust his instincts.
Yeah, I just mean on that emotional level, people tend to err away from it.
Human psychology.
Yeah.
He generally plays quite quickly. I think he's at least considering all 3 options here. I don't know why he feels so strongly that this is a good spot, though. Maybe he just doesn't want to let Jeremy kind of run over these situations, as there are going to be future blind encounters between the two.
Did you just see how he flicked his cards in? He did not want to let that hand go. That was really, really interesting.
We will see more hands like that throughout the day, as a couple years back, the rules to this event got changed so that you are now allowed to limp, whereas previously you had to at least come in for a minimum raise. So in these small blind, big blind confrontations, you'll typically see a lot of limped pots, as obviously the small blind has a lot of incentive to continue, much like in No Limit Hold'em. However, here the ante is even larger than in a typical big blind ante of No Limit Hold'em. So a limping strategy is often employed by good players in these tournaments.
This is a nice hand for Watson here.
Raise 110.
It's nice because of the blocker properties and the strength of the hand. However, because of the presence of the gut shot, it's actually a little bit weaker than it appears. And this hand probably cannot continue against a 3-bet. As Krella does pick up an interesting hand, they're both in early position and have deep stacks. A 10-9-8 is a little dicey to play a large pot with. Let's see how Krella approaches this situation. As we see, he does go with the conservative just call.
Which is super interesting since there's not much convertibility with this hand. So he's going to pat, right?
He's planning to pat and probably just fold if anyone jams behind him. So he's taking the conservative route. Now, there is a big downside to this play, right? Which is that Watson is going to mostly know that Krella has a weak holding after he pats.
The ranges are capped when you play a hand in this way. You leave yourself open to exploitation, and you also put yourself in the blender against competent opponents who are going to draw one and then lead into you often in order to test your resolve.
Yeah, and Watson starting out with a pair of 7s. If he were to catch another pair here, he will have a very, very viable candidate for a big bluff.
Another thing looking to catch is a 9-8 or deuce, of course.
Yeah, I would expect
work too.
I would expect large sizes from Watson if he bets here.
I don't think we got this replacement card scanned, which is going to make things a little mysterious for us. And whatever you do, don't read into the look on Watson's face. I've observed this gentleman over the years. While he looks like he just caught the most depressing card in the deck, perhaps the 14 of clubs, but he definitely could have a deuce in there, just make nothing of the affect.
And he is going to find a bet here, and let's see what size he comes with in a 370K pot. So a pretty hefty 90%, 80%.
I was about to say one issue with the line that Krella's taken is that when Watson makes a decent value hand or a bluff, he can choose a really large size, just
Absolutely.
knowing that Krella is super.
I would actually say this
capped.
is probably Watson's small size. So
I think this would have been an overbet in a normal situation, and a pot size bet represents a pretty large size, given that they're two of the bigger stacks in the tournament.
And now Krella's in the very undesirable position of playing a pure guessing game against one of the great no-limit players in the world.
I mean, the 10 is either wildly ahead or wildly behind as played, is it not?
Correct, and this is the crux of no-limit single draw. Typically, this is the river decision that you're often facing with a pat hand. You beat all bluffs, you beat no value. He might think about what his range looks like here for flatting the open, and he may be feeling that a 10-9-8-6-5 is one of the weaker hands that he could be holding here. So it does make some sense to let this one go.
And that's exactly what he does, preserving 325,000 off of his stack, which continues to be the largest at the table. Do you take issue at all with the flat pat in position, Chris, or is that something that we need to have? On balance, though, he needs to show up with better than 10-9 with some frequency, does he not?
Okay, so it's an interesting question. Players have different styles for how they approach that spot. I do think a 10-9-8 in that situation is a reasonable hand to consider flatting with, because by 3-betting, you really are in a difficult situation if he continues and draws one anyway. Obviously, facing a 4-bet would be kind of a disaster. You do want to make sure you're capable of balancing it out with some stronger hands, or you're capable of making some strong hero calls on the river. So we'll see as the day progresses if Krella finds other pat hands in that situation to play similarly. It is definitely a spot where he could have some traps, including some very, very premium hands. Jeremy finds a very nice hand here on the button. These 10-8s can be a little bit difficult to play at depth because sometimes that 10 becomes a pesky card.
Raise 110.
But there is convertibility. Not that we're in the business of breaking 10s with real frequency, but depending on action.
Yeah, it's just sometimes a difficult decision what to do with this 10. Whereas you're pretty much always keeping your 9s, and you're pretty much not keeping too many jacks when you have a nice draw like this underneath it. Watts probably has a defendable hand here against a button raise of a small size and draw to this rough 10-9-7 deuce. Sometimes you'll see players even turn these hands into 3-bet semi-bluffs.
And just pat the king?
No, and then draw if called. You know, in that situation, he'd be hoping that he's up against a draw 2 that just folds.
Yeah.
Watson currently finds himself in the least exciting situation in single draw where you do not want to get there.
He is drawing dead and could get himself into a little bit of trouble here, and he does.
10-9-7-4 deuce behind the 10-8 pat. But again, late position open, pat the button. Ausmus certainly doesn't have to have 10-9 beat.
I would like to see Watson actually make a block bet here, I think. He actually goes with check, but I think his hand is strong enough to make a value bet. You have to think that Ausmus can have every jack, and possibly even some hands like that 5, 6, 7, 8 queen that we saw Scott open earlier. 10-9-7 is probably doing a little bit better as a lead than when you check and face a bet. As we see Jeremy going for relatively thin value and probably going to get snap called. Yep.
10-8-7.
Fortunately for Watson, that was quite the small bet because I think he was ready to pay off most sizes there.
So this tiny bet that Ausmus made here is not really a thing. It's a little dangerous to reopen the action to a very strong player who is going to be capable of finding check raises. However, in this case, he just basically played the strength of his actual holding and was able to get paid off by a worse hand. I would be a little wary of that, though, against Watts in the future.
Yeah, the stronger the player, the less you want to be reopening the action at little gain. And by little gain, I mean when you do get called, you're not picking up very many chips relative to the pot, right?
Exactly. We might see the out-of-position player use these little block sizes frequently, but the in-position player should typically go a little bigger. David Lin picks up a slightly tempting hand in early position. However, this is a hand that can often be overvalued by inexperienced players. This is not nearly a strong enough draw to open. As nobody's picked up much so far this round, and we will have a blind confrontation between two of our bigger stacks. Earlier we saw Sir Watts limp in with a 4-card 10, so we can see that he's probably going to be employing a limping strategy fairly often. You want to mix in limps and raises with some of your better 4 cards. And
but
this
you
time
also
it
want
looks
to be
like
mindful, just in terms of tournament, not to interrupt you, Vitch, you've got that boss stack
right.
of Krella to your direct left, which can be very abusive. All of the same phenomena in terms of ICM pressure exist here, regardless of what variant of poker we're playing.
Absolutely, Ali. Good point. We do see Watts come in with a relatively large open raise this time for a little for 3.25, 3.5, and you know, the quality of his draw is a little stronger in this hand, holding a 9-6-5-4. I do think Krella has a defensible hand here that can draw 2. Being in position drawing 2 is not so bad. A lot of good things can happen on the river, and clearly he still has the ability to make a strong holding.
Position is just so important in this game. Seeing how many your opponent draws, or if they draw, is such an advantage.
Absolutely.
Information also very, very key. Krella having a second 7 as his hand is something he'll be taking into consideration.
Look, Jeremy, Player of the Year. Leaderboard.
Long way to go.
Close.
Long way to go.
Short way to go.
That's a nice needle
you're
by
number
Jen
3.
off to the side over there.
And also a very nice draw for Sir Watts, Vitch. It's not lost on you. 9-6 low.
He caught his best card.
Yeah, 2 of the top.
I'm playing with Super Pro.
So, in a 1 versus 2 situation, a 9-6 is clearly worthy of a value bet. If you know your opponent is on the aggressive side, however, this hand can make a good check raise. You would induce a bluff from pairs, and potentially even from plenty of worse hands that would think about value betting after you check. Instead, we see a relatively healthy pot size bet, just under pot. So he's just going with what I would consider the standard line, hoping to get called by all sorts of hands that hope he's bluffing. We don't have Krella's hand here, but I would certainly be paying this bet off relatively light. I mean, blocking an 8-7-7 is not ideal pre. Those are where some of Sir Watts' bluffs would come from.
For 4 years, I played like 10 events each year and one bracelet.
More valuable would be the 9 pairing? Like
no,
that
you would.
Krella
doesn't want to have any of those cards. Krella would much rather have 2, 3, 4, Queen, King.
I won really low price pool, right?
Because that in that situation, Watts could be bluffing from all of the pairs in between.
Right. 130. Yeah. And I bricked all the high rollers.
There's also an outside chance that Krella has made an 8 here. I mean, he was drawing live to beat this hand, and if so, he would definitely be able to raise. We don't have his
hand. That would be really something if he made an 8 right here on the draw too.
And he would be able to use a massive size.
Oh my gosh.
He has found a raise.
And look at Sir Watts, immediately disgusted by that declaration, because we'd always anticipate that anybody willing to call a raise of that size out of the big blind and draw 2 is doing so smooth.
This raise is too small, in my opinion. And he did make it, 8-7-5-3-2.
Wow.
This is not as that. It's a lot of chips relative to the stacks at the table, but it's a very small raise size relative to the bet.
I'm just here to play, you know.
But that's designed, of course, to retain a wide array of Watson's hands here, including some of those 10s.
This would be a heroic fold from Sir Watts with a 9-6 facing only this size. I think Krella could have even shoved here, blocking a 7 pre.
There are certainly some reasons Watson might consider folding here. Obviously, the theory says he has to call, and he does.
Pretty cold deck in this situation.
By the way, that's about as animated as you'll see Sir Watts. I mean, in the no-limit hold'em streets, we don't often see that reaction, and perhaps this is why we have the personalities that we do in mixed games, Chris. You're very familiar with them from having played through the years. It can drive you mad out there in ways that 2-card really doesn't seem to affect a lot of the pros.
Certainly, Watson caught his absolute best card and ends up losing a sizable pot versus a hand he was way ahead of. Jesse, I'm a little curious about what some of the reasons you might think about for folding there, though.
So there, I feel as if he might consider this to be an underbluff spot. Chip leader versus chip leader.
Yeah.
His opponent drew 2. He bet large, and his opponent decided to raise. It's a unique situation relative to how many hands they're going to see at this final table. Also, shipping chips to the chip leader on your direct left is the absolute last thing that you're looking to do. So if you're ever feeling like you might have a spot you could hero fold, it would probably be a situation like that.
That all makes sense. I would be a little wary about being able to beat some thin value.
That's something that you also got to, yeah, for sure. You need to weigh that into the equation.
Some
there might be a couple
9-7
pips.
raising there, perhaps.
I think it's possible. Now, obviously, these players have played with each other for the better part of 3 days now, and they may have a much firmer understanding of each other's ranges in that spot than I can from just observing a couple hands.
Onwards we march. Min raise open from a very nice looking 1-card draw to an 85 by Seiver. Ausmus with the dreaded open-ender.
Yeah, I think he's a little tempted here because of the chip stacks. I would like to see this hand play as a 3-bet bluff if he continued. It can draw 1 if called. He just goes for the pretty standard fold.
That's what's up.
Varela has really pulled away from the field here.
Yeah, to the newly minted 4.1 million plus. He'll sit this one out.
Yeah, almost 1.2.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, David Lin is on a short stack. He has 19 blinds and a Pat Jack 9 in the big blind, facing an under the gun open. This is a very difficult decision. It's one of those hands where if you shove and get called, you have to stand pat, but you are in danger of them patting behind and you being out of the tournament.
You know, it's interesting. I've never used this nomenclature before, but I dare regard this as a coupe instead of a convertible, if you know what I mean, given the nature of the gut shot straight draw.
Instead, we see Lin come with a call, which I assume means that he is going to break the jack and draw to his gut shot 9865.
But wants to do so for a cheaper price.
Yeah. This seems reasonable considering Jen Harman's short stack. Busting in this situation with 0% equity would be pretty disappointing. Seiver is also probably happy, will be happy the way this worked out because he would not be able to fold the 2-4-5-8 versus the jam, I don't believe. And neither player really wants to play a flip in that situation.
Oh my goodness.
Lin is in trouble now.
Yeah, they both made it. Lin catching the 3 and making the 9-8-6. Seiver sliding right into an 86, which is a whole lot of hand. I'm not even sure he knows it yet, by the way. Oftentimes in no limit deuce, in the interest of not giving off any physical tells, we'll see the player in position not look at their draw, because you can't pick up anything off a man that doesn't know what he has.
Now, this is a fascinating situation. Different from the one I mentioned earlier where I said that Sir Watts could have bet with his 10-9 in the big blind versus a button pat range. Because here, Scott Seiver has raised under the gun, and while both players draw 1, Seiver has by far and away the stronger draw 1 range. I believe for that reason that David could consider a check with a hand that's kind of in the middle part of his range at this point. He instead comes with a bet, and he is going to face a nasty decision here, as I cannot imagine Seiver just calling.
Feels as if Seiver has one size here as well.
For sure. Given that Lin only has 615 behind, and Scott is known as a fearless and aggressive player, I would expect a little Hollywood and an all-in. And then David Lin is going to have a difficult, difficult decision.
Coupe, huh, Ollie?
I mean, apparently it was convertible, but as played, we can understand. He just said, okay, I'll play for the 50K. I'll take 1. Trouble, of course, quite obvious now, as his 150 has become 765. This is so meaty.
This is a very difficult decision. This is one of the better hands that David Lin would have in his big blind defending range. He's against an extremely competent player. He does not block deuces or 7s, which would make for good bluff-raising hands.
Vitch, to be fair, he also doesn't unblock any 10s. Now, I'm not sure how often that's going to be a part of the process here out of Seiver. It would seem unlikely. A 10-7 would just be happy to flat the 150 and bluff catch.
Correct. He makes a nice laydown.
Yeah.
That is a difficult fold.
Yeah.
He made that look easier than it is.
Well, credit to Mr. Lin, who's got a relatively modest $70,000 in career tournament earnings across 14 caches. Hometown of Columbia, Missouri. Lives in New York City now. Well, if you guys would like to win a seat to the 2025 WSOP main event, we're giving away not 1, not 2, but 3 of them. And all PokerGo annual and VIP subscribers are eligible to win. Upgrade your plan today. Be sure to use promo code WSOP24WIN to save $20 off your first year of a new annual plan. Void where prohibited. No purchase necessary. Visit PokerGo.com/rules for official terms. And just to prevent you from having to visit that website Jesse and Chris, you are not eligible. I apologize.
Bummer.
You probably didn't know that when you signed up for today's broadcast, but you've disqualified yourselves.
Yeah,
Fair.
I mean, I wasn't aware of that, and I'd actually like to...
I'd actually like to rescind my participation today.
I'm out, fellas.
No, by the way, 10-7-5-4 under normal circumstances may be a playable hand. Monotone, however, meaning all the spade iterations of that 10 low draw would be no good, as flushes and straights do count against us.
Yeah, that certainly diminishes the quality of the draw, knowing that 25% of the cards that would normally improve you make you a flush instead, and you can no longer beat anything.
By the way, I didn't mean to suggest that it's only a no-limit deuce that those things are problems. Any variant of any deuce to 7 lowball game, straights and flushes are a problem.
I hope I have just absolutely nothing.
And this is a game, guys, that once upon a time would be spread as just a standalone game and quite big stakes. But these days it lives on as many other games, I feel like, do predominantly courtesy of the advent of mixed games and really nowhere else.
Yeah, that's true. It's certainly not a common cash game, and it's not necessarily even found in all of the cash mix games that often. Typically, it's played with a relatively shallow cap. So sometimes for these players, being able to play uncapped no-limit single draw, the WSOP tournaments might be the only place to do so.
Man, if you haven't had a lot of experience at a game, I can't pick a worse game to play super deep stacked with little experience than deuce to 7 no limit single draw.
I tend to agree, Jesse. It is an absolute pucker up. They should just call the game guts in that situation. Because in the cash mixed game streets, as we can see here, Krella with a bonus deuce and a 98 draw will min raise open, it's often capped. 10 big bets, I think, is fairly standard. So as not to make it disproportionately big in relation to the remainder of the predominantly limit or split pot games that are played in any given cash game mix. And that keeps it, you know, fairly mechanized, but then you have a lot more room for art, dare I say, in the uncapped streets.
Absolutely.
Yeah. 10 big bets is a really nice, snug stack size to learn the game, feel it out, get used to certain situations. You start getting hit with these 4x pot size bets, you know, your life gets difficult very quickly.
So Jeremy makes a pretty standard defense with the 2-4-5 here. Draw 2 versus draw 1. He makes the king-queen. At first glance, it doesn't look like he's caught very well, but this is actually a relatively good calling hand. As I was mentioning earlier, he unblocks all of those medium to high pairs that his opponent will be tempted to bluff. And when you're in a draw 2 versus draw 1, you definitely have to defend your range relatively lightly.
Yeah.
If Krella makes a hand, any hand between a 10 and better here, he can easily go for a value bet. A jack as well would be close. And the queen feels like probably a check down.
Check.
Yep, fairly standard.
King, queen.
Delighted to see that a king is what Ausmus produced. And by the way, Ausmus declares the king-queen with the sense that at some frequency, Krella's going to be checking back a pair.
True, although honestly, sometimes you'd rather face a bet when you have the king-queen because you really only kind of beat the ace low, maybe the small pair when they check.
Yeah.
Krella's really on a roll right now.
So far, making it look pretty clean. He hasn't really had to step out of line too much, although he did make that one nice bluff raise with that pair of 5s against Sir Watts as we first came on. So he's in there playing the game. For a guy with not quite the tournament resume of some of the other players at the table, Krella has shown himself to be very comfortable so far.
Tend to agree with you, although some of the hands that he's been delivered, namely that 8 versus the 9 of Sir Watts, have lent to some of that comfort. Started playing poker back in 2003, did Krella. His highest career WSOP finish came back in 2006 in a $1,500 pot limit Omaha event. That was a 47th place finish, but here he is well ahead of that result and perhaps even poised to take down his first bracelet.
I love this open. I was just going to say, if I'm Krella, I feel like I can start stepping on a little with my chip stack. And this 4-card 10 is not normally an open, but he is correctly understanding the tournament dynamics at the final table and adjusting very nicely.
The presence of Lin sitting on those 11 bigs, let's call them, very much aids his ability to do this, as again, we turn our attention to the ICM, and luxuries afforded the big stack come in part courtesy of said ICM.
30, 60, 90.
Looking at the payouts for this one, fellas, $68,672 is on lockup, $93,615 if you can get from 6th to 5th, and up top, over $411,000.
Certainly all players will be looking at those top couple payouts and be thinking, if I can ladder up a little bit, there's some good money at the end.
And not unlike any other 10K championship event here at the World Series, we tend to see the upper crust, a pretty dense, pro-packed field, not usually too many entries. And a lot of people actually kind of tend to sit these out, who I know to be professionals, because they think to themselves, there's not a whole lot of EV. I'm going up against world beaters. But many have said world beaters would like nothing more than to square off against their ilk. Here's Krella, 10-9-8 open.
Tricky decision for David Lin here. His hand is not particularly strong, but he only has 10 big blinds, and in 2 hands, he'll have to post the big blind ante and the big blind, which is 150K. He might think that versus an active chip leader, this is enough hand to jam. If he gets called and patted in front, he may have to consider breaking.
Well, staring right into the crystal ball accurately.
And Ausmus picks up a tempting hand.
In the face of an open and a jam.
Yeah,
now, while we can discount Krella as the chip leader as an opener to a certain degree, Lin's willingness to move all in front of us does present issues. Now, the good news if Ausmus were to get involved in this particular pot, and I'd love your thoughts on that, by the way, Chris, is that in the face of a pat, he can very easily break the jack, and in the face of a draw one, then he's got a bit of a decision.
This actually opens up the door for David Lin to survive this confrontation. If Jeremy Ausmus takes an aggressive action, I believe Krella will have an easy fold of his 10-9-8. And then Lin will be able to pat with his jack and gut shot draw and actually be in okay shape against the 8-7-4-3 of Jeremy. And Jeremy looks like he's coming with a call. So now I'm curious to see what Krella reads into this.
How often is the call by Ausmus attached to a patting hand better than this jack?
I would say somewhat often. I mean, he should be playing many of his hands as a call here.
And looking to retain Krella as the opener?
Well, he's just more or less saying, I have a good hand. You have to be a little wary of me. I don't necessarily feel I need to re-raise. Krella has a pretty difficult decision here. I would not be surprised to see a fold. I might find a fold in this situation myself. I would be pretty terrified of this cold call from Ausmus.
Yeah, it feels as though this hand is right on the precipice where you don't feel very good about it. If it was a little stronger, maybe you could make some considerations to either play, really throwing one or patting your hand. But
how often is a smoother 10 on the button in your eyes, Fitch?
It's definitely a reasonable part of Ausmus's range. Krella, if he doesn't fold here, I mean, I think all 3 options are slightly on the table. He could abuse his chip stack to try to push Jeremy off better pats by jamming, but I just don't think that's very likely. I think he just mostly has to dislike his hand here immensely after facing a 3-bet jam from a short stack under the gun +1 and a cold call from a stack that doesn't have a lot of incentive to get involved particularly lightly.
It would seem egregiously high variance for Krella to risk taking such a high variance approach to this 10-9-8 by jamming in the hopes that he can move Ausmus off of what is a dry side pot.
Agreed. And we do see him make a reasonable fold for sure. We see he has the best hand, but I think it was super reasonable. And like I said, now David Lin has a difficult decision. He looks like he's going to break this jack. I'm not sure what the best play is here. Having the gut shot 7-6-5-3 in his hand is not ideal. And Jeremy now has the easy pat with his jack.
Yeah,
and we see that Krella looks disappointed.
Standard and customary is Ausmus revealing the fact that he's got the jack-8 here as Lin will draw, and he will survive. The 9 slides right on into that gutter.
And notice that if Lin had pat, Ausmus would have caught the 9 and busted it. So a very fortuitous decision for David Lin.
Oh, not against it.
And if Jeremy had made a tight fold pre-flop, Lin would have caught it against, would have doubled up against Krella as well. Sorry to interrupt you.
Well, if you go with it, he breaks, and maybe he just scoops everyone, you know? Because we don't know what the card on top of duck is.
A lot of permutations of how that could have shaken out, as is the case in this game.
What's that?
But nevertheless, now we have Jen Harman on the very short stack relative to everyone else at the table, as Lynn has gotten himself out of the danger zone with that key double up.
Do you think that Jeremy gave any consideration to the idea that Krella behind him would fold just a few hands that are a little bit stronger than the jack? That has to weigh into his decision-making there, right?
Yeah, I think so, and I think that I like it because his hand is very easy to play, right? Unless Krella were to go all in, Jeremy has relatively easy decisions after that. If Krella continues and stands pat, or even continues and draws 1 and David Lynn stands pat, Ausmus has an easy break to draw to his very nice-looking 4-card 8. So it was a little bit dicey to get involved, period, against 2 early position raises, but his hand does play nicely.
Yeah, having that extreme convertibility is just it opens so many doors, and the fact that you're on the button, you get to act last and draws is just enormous.
Yep, and he felt comfortable enough to get involved.
Jack 8-7.
Jack 8-7, 4.
So Jen will be looking for a spot to get her stack in, but this is not it. If it had folded to her, she could jam the button with this hand.
Watson with a draw to 9-5.
Now, this is a hand that normally you would play and probably play as a call. With the short stack of Jen out there, I could see a fold.
Well, Watson stands in disagreement as he will invest the extra 90,000. Let's see what Krella peeks down at.
These sort of 4-card 9s, Jesse, they feel to me like the sort of hands that, like, from an ICM perspective, you might like to cut out of your range when you are really trying to reduce variance and watch out for short stacks.
Do you think that the fact that his opponent's coming in with the absolute stone min raise and the ante is so large compels him to just stick around with those sort of hands?
Perhaps so.
So Seiver against the draw 1, a favorite with the Jack 9 low, does stand pat and awaits Watson's approach to what is now King 9.
Not much going on here. Neither player has much incentive to bet. Pretty customary for Watson to just show his king.
First blue chip.
Uncommon for players to request to see the whole hand to see what sort of a hand he was drawing at, as everyone understands that his range is pretty legit there.
Now, Vitch, I don't know how much you played with Seiver, and I would imagine he does this a little bit more in the cash game streets than the tournament ones, but I'm always disappointed when he checks back at Showdown and doesn't do so with his trademark crossed forearms and declaration of, it's a shutdown.
I guess it just depends on his mood, right? He's got all the gears. I did play with him for a number of hours in this event yesterday on day 2, and he was certainly in talkative form, often happy to discuss hands as they were playing out with him involved, even, you know, facing big bets. So Scott can get in there and talk with the best of the mid-hand, as we've seen on a number of streets over the years.
He's cut his teeth in the Bobby's Room streets over the years, playing nosebleed cash games, which often would include this particular iteration of poker. He's very, very comfortable here at this final table with tremendous volume played in terms of no limit deuce. I would imagine more so than just about everyone in the field, bar maybe Jennifer Harman, who's been at it a bit longer and also played in those same streets in Bobby's for many, many years, such a true legend of the game.
I think you're right. I would say that because of Scott Seiver's extensive high-stakes no-limit hold'em experience as well, he may even have the experiential edge on Jen. So David Lynn has to decide, okay, I have these newfound chips. How much do I want to get involved? I'm only facing a min-raise. I have a 3-6-7 that can easily defend my big blind and draw 2. However, again, with the other short stack out there, maybe you just reduce variance and just kind of just get out of the way in the situation. Draw 2 versus an under-the-gun draw 1 is certainly not a profitable situation generally. You're just hoping to sort of get your share of the ante. You're not going to like facing much post-draw action.
I don't think you're going to like having a couple of jacks in your hand either in the event that your opponent pats.
Correct. He'll be happy to see
them
draw
to the 10 or better, yeah.
Yeah. At least in the draw 2, draw 1, you have more equity.
So here we go. Pair of 9s for Lynn. And let's see.
We're going to find out a lot. We're going to find out a lot about David Lin right now. This is a hand that people would be tempted to bluff in a number of ways. Potentially a lead, potentially a check raise. In my mind, it's mostly just a check fold, though. You're up against a very strong range. You don't want to overbluff in this situation, particularly against a player of Scott's caliber. Now, the interesting question to me is, will Scott think his pair fours has enough showdown value here, or will he elect to bluff? He knows he can put a tremendous amount of pressure on a short stack, but actually just snap checks back and is going to win and be very happy.
Now, I have to ask you here, Chris, because you said he doesn't want to overbluff the situation, but if he isn't bluffing with a pair of nines, does he have any bluffs, really? He drew 2, so obviously he could make trips.
Yeah, the thing is, when you draw 2, it's actually not that hard to make a straight 2-pair, 3 of a kind. And when you're in a draw 2 versus draw 1 situation, you're at a big range disadvantage. So you rarely get many leads anyway. So typically, we would often see good players just check their range there and then play check raise, check fold, and check call. And I would be pretty terrified to open up the action with a pair of 9s there as a check raise bluff.
High blinds.
I like the way you put that out there.
That way, like every part is both the skill.
It is definitely a situation where inexperienced players overbluff because of the reasons that you said. They think, well, I have these bad hands, I have to bluff. But the reality is they just don't have that many good hands. Their range becomes entirely bluffs.
You're just like, oh yeah, small balled the hell out of them. Okay, cool. It was all meaningless. Let's flip a coin. It's kind of fun. You get both of the fun parts of a tournament like in one.
Yeah, it's a fun channel.
Trash napkins for Ausmus.
Jen has to be feeling pressure to find a hand before the big blind.
Well, that's exactly what Watson has done here. 10-9-6-5 tray.
Now, Watson has 15 big blinds and a shorter stack behind him. This is a difficult hand to play, as you don't really want to face a 3-bet. It would not shock me to see an open jam. Instead, he comes with the small size.
Just north of the min.
He'll be very happy to get through the button here, as playing his hand out of position can be quite
That's the big hurdle.
Yeah. And Scott being the medium hurdle in the big blind.
Started with $1 million.
Ooh. With a very interesting candidate for a bluff raise. But no, he doesn't give much consideration to that and quickly goes with call.
One thing that ICM certainly causes a lot is a lot of extra passivity at the table. So you see a lot more peels out of the big blind. This is true in no limit too, of course, than you would normally see.
See, I might overdo it in Scott's seat here. I might be thinking, well, I can get Watson to fold everything with Jen's short stack by playing as a jam.
Well, Seiver instead flats and makes himself the 9-7.
Wow, I'm surprised that Scott quickly checked there. His hand feels like a natural value bet to me. It's not really a good enough hand to go for a check raise.
Either.
Watson does astutely check back against that draw 1, however. Will be quite pleased that he chose to do so, as Scott promptly announces 9-7.
Yeah, that would have been a difficult situation for Watson to face a bet.
Seiver pretty much snap checked after looking down at his card. I wonder if Watson read into that at all, thinking maybe he's a little bit more polar.
Right, yeah, that's interesting.
Literally
I'd be really curious to hear Scott's thought process on that check, because to me, the 9-7 just feels like kind of a middle-of-the-road hand, and those usually play nicely as value bets. It certainly is not strong enough to check raise, and you know, you feel like it's just going to go check a lot, and you always win. I would not be thinking that Watson has a lot of snows in that situation.
Yeah, and to be honest, if I'm ever going to read into the live tells of a player, I think Seiver might be the last guy on the planet that I'm trying to do that with. He's just always throwing out little counter tells. And
so Krella has an easy open here. Not only is it an okay hand, possibly even an okay bluffing hand, but with Jen Harman having folded pre and Sir Watts having folded pre, he can put tremendous pressure on the players behind him, who have to play very conservatively in this spot.
Mindful of Harman's short stack. Nothing of much interest, although Ausmus, he's 5'6", defendable.
Pretty standard defend to draw 2. The question is, will he avoid the situation because of those short stacks, as I made reference to earlier? But no, he's getting in there. And Krella's going to have an interesting decision. If he's going to see the draw 2 in front of him. Does he want to draw 2 and play 3-6-8 versus a draw 2? Or does he want to bluff? It's a very reasonable hand to snow with.
I would agree. This seems like a very natural candidate in the face of a draw 2 to stand pat. Krella does exactly that. And we've got our first snow of this final table.
So Krella's playing the game. I mean, he's looked very comfortable. Ausmus is
wow.
Now, if Jeremy could see his hand, he would happily check here. This is a hand, though, that may want to consider a lead, thinking that that the player pats a lot of weak hands like jacks and even some queens when he draws 2 in the big blind.
Would the lead from Ausmus not read stronger than average in consideration of the ICM, though?
Yes, but Krella has a very tempting hand to not give up. Let's say that.
And by the way, it's not a given that when Ausmus leads over here, Krella can't continue the bluff line and then raise and really put Jeremy in a blender.
There's a lot going on here now. This hand is not over. Jeremy does look like he's going to find a lead.
The stage is set here, gentlemen. When we block 3 8s in our hand in particular, and we know how difficult it would be for Jeremy to produce a 7 or an 8, I mean, I think I like leaning.
So Ausmus goes with a full pot size bet, representing quite a strong hand here, which he has. How much heart does Krella have here? What does he want to do? Because obviously, I agree with you, Ali, by shoving here, he would put a tremendous amount of pressure on Ausmus's range. Would Ausmus risk busting 6 with 2 shorter stacks at the table?
1 million.
And Krella goes for it. I love this guy. This
Is the sizing big enough?
Yeah, I'm surprised he didn't shove here.
Well, he earlier played a similar size when he did 2-hop that 8-7 against Watson. So this just may be, in his mind, the right size. It is certainly credible. Jeremy has a monster hand, though.
If I'm Jeremy and I unblock 8s and 7s here, and we know that with some frequency, snows are supposed to be a part of the range of all players, but in particular, Krella seems to be most incentivized perhaps to be dancing in that manner. Do we consider things like 8s and 7s, trip 7s, trip 8s to be involved across the way?
I think you have to consider it. Like I said earlier, these guys have played together, you know, a decent bit over the last couple days, I would assume. This is a pretty difficult decision for Jeremy. Many players do not have bluffs in this spot. And when you have a 9 and unblock the 8 and the 7, and you don't think your opponent has bluffs, well, guess what? They have an 8 or a 7. So it really depends on how Jeremy thinks about Krella's play. I will say this, it's quite convenient for Krella to have a hand strong enough to value raise in this spot. Most good players, I would be a little suspicious of here. This is not a fun spot for Jeremy.
This is as bad as it gets for Jeremy right now. You're just, you drew 2, you look down at a 9-6, you're loving your hand, you lead out, and your opponent puts in a big raise.
In some ways, Krella leaving him a few chips behind looks even stronger, right? Like the all-in might look a little weaker.
You might even suspect when you see your opponent do this for value earlier that his bluffs would go bigger and maybe his value goes smaller.
Yeah.
You don't know it, but you might suspect it.
This screams, I have a monster, I want to get called. I really love the way Krella's played this final table so far.
That said, Jeremy is getting quite good odds here.
Right. This is just one of those situations. Some players don't have bluffs in the spot. Others are going to find the proper ones. Your hand is meant to call, probably.
Yeah.
I'm a bit surprised that Jeremy isn't spending more time looking directly across the way at Krella trying to pick up anything, because as we know, with the limited information involved in any given no-limit deuce hand, a lot of our choices do boil down to some physical tells pushing us one way or the other.
You know, Ollie, I always wonder when guys have sunglasses on whether they're not quietly looking at their opponent as they turn the other way, if they're not, you know, keeping their eyes to the right and gazing at them, because
those are dark lenses. We have no idea exactly where his eyes are trained. It doesn't feel like he's spending that much time, though, dressing down Krella.
Yeah, he's more trying to think about how many chips would I have left if I call and lose. Where am I in my range? Blocking and unblocking effects like you mentioned earlier, Ali. I think he's considering the hand on a more technical level at the moment. It'd be interesting to get a shot at Krella here to see how comfortable he looks, though.
Yeah.
Even when he was looking at his cards again and snapped them
wow,
down.
he gets it through.
Oh, man.
What a play.
Bravo.
Oh, boy.
Loving this Jonathan Krella. Jonathan, right?
Handsome John is
Handsome
what he'd like
John.
to be referred to as.
Handsome John getting it done. What a great play.
And
He's a futures trader by profession, by the way, so risk tolerance definitely in his wheelhouse.
Oh, man after your own heart, Ollie.
Yeah. Well, not futures.
90 seconds.
Trading.
You know, yeah, I'm into it.
You're in the mix.
93,000 plus in career tournament earnings for him across 10 caches.
I mean, that was kind of probably a ridiculous fold.
I'll tell you what, it's going to be really interesting later on at this final table when the players get word of some of these hands and start to understand that maybe they've underestimated our chip leader Krella a little bit.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that.
I'll tell you one thing. When Jeremy finds out he was bluffed for that size and that situation, he is going to be hating